Chapter 8 The Founder. It will be remembered that when Don Bosco was chaplain at the Refuge and beginning his work for the boys of Turin, some of his colleagues among the clergy came to the conclusion that he showed signs of incipient lunacy. Certainly, they interpreted as a serious symptom the fact that he informed them that he was thinking of founding a religious order. "Well, Don Bosco, you're still thinking of your oratory, are you?" inquired the two ecclesiastics who came to submit him to a discreet examination. "More than ever," he replied. "Soon I shall have a large building with playgrounds, evening classes, workshops, a church to hold 500 boys, and priests, catechists, masters, and trade instructors to help me." "Then you're thinking of founding a religious congregation?" "Yes, indeed." "But what habit will you give your religious?" "I shall clothe them with virtue," replied Don Bosco. No surer indication of his mental deterioration was needed. In the state of the country at that time, and in view of the prevailing trend of opinion, it certainly seemed like madness to speak of founding a congregation. The government was overtly opposed to the religious orders. Many of the clergy were infected with the liberal ideas then current, and the general trend of the times was to an increasing anti-clericalism and irreligion. The religious state was held in small esteem even by a great number of Catholics. Vocations were becoming rarer, and the recruitment of the diocesan clergy was beginning to prove difficult, so that the prevailing view was towards retrenchment and against new undertakings. In these circumstances, we may understand perhaps some of the misgivings aroused among his colleagues by the ideas of this young priest, so recently out of the convento and just settling down to work at his first post as chaplain to an orphanage. On the other hand, we have seen how what were generally imagined to be Don Bosco's madcap schemes were brought to successful fulfillment in a comparatively short space of time. Indeed, in thus tracing the rapid development of his work for boys, we have been obliged to continue the story down to 1856 without mention of the steps taken to achieve the last mentioned item on his program, the foundation of a religious congregation to take charge of the oratory and all its activities. Don Bosco's attempts to obtain subjects who should assist him in his work go back, in fact, to the period while he was still a student priest at the convento. In 1841, among the boys who first came on Sundays to his festive oratory, he chose a few in whom he saw the possibilities of vocation. It was all very vague, no doubt, and the boys' learning were extremely small. Nevertheless, he thought it worthwhile endeavouring to teach them the rudiments of Latin. One by one they left him, and finally he was back where he started. Twice more he tried with small groups of promising boys, and twice more he failed. He turned then to the clergy of Turin and endeavoured to recruit a small community from among their ranks. He encountered nothing but refusal. Then, for the fourth time, he tried with the boys who frequented the oratory. In July 1849, 4 young apprentices were asked if they would agree to help him with the festive oratory. In return, he undertook to help them complete their primary school course, teach them Latin, and, he told them, if God so allowed it, perhaps one day they would be priests. The state of their education at that moment reveals the kind of material with which Don Bosco had to deal, and also something of his courage and determination. One of the boys had completed his primary course. The others could just read, and were able to write sufficiently to sign their names. The 4 youths, they were called Belia, Buzzetti, Gastini, and Reviglio, embraced with considerable enthusiasm the program thus outlined for them. 18 months of hard work followed. Don Bosco, assisted by another priest, taught the boys so successfully that on the 2nd of February 1851, with the permission of his exiled Archbishop, Monsignor Franzoni, he was able to give the cassock to his 4 pupils. Soon they began their philosophy at the University of Turin. But this first success, in spite of initial signs to the contrary, was to prove no more enduring than previous attempts. One by one, the young clerics left Don Bosco, 2 of them abandoning all idea of the priesthood, and the others entering the diocesan seminary. It is worthwhile pointing out that Don Bosco had begun teaching them and given them the cassock before his purchase of the Penardi house, and therefore well before he had adequate premises for his oratory. He always saw far ahead. Discouragement found no place in Don Bosco's philosophy of life. For the 5th time he began again. As far back as 1845, he had encountered a boy of 10 who was generally attracted by him, and frequently at the Porta Palazzo he would meet this little lad, Michael Rua, on his way to the Christian Brothers' School. He would ask Don Bosco for a medal or some small souvenir of the sort, but always received the same strange reply, though his companions generally obtained what they asked for. "Here you are, Michael," Don Bosco would remark, holding out his left hand, palm upwards, with the right hand making as if to cut it in 2. Michael Rua could never divine what the gesture meant, and it was only explained to him years later, on the 3rd of October 1853, when, after some time with Don Bosco, he received the cassock at his hands. "From now on, Michael," Don Bosco then told him, "we shall go halves in everything." For some months past, Michael Rua had been studying Latin in company with the other youths from the oratory, Caliero, Francesia, Turchi, Roccietta, Bonetti, and the little ceremony which took place at Becchi, where Don Bosco had gone with some of his boys for the wine harvest, formed the end of the primary stage of the first Salesian's journey towards the priesthood. All this, no doubt, was clear in Don Bosco's mind. He was convinced that he was intended to found a congregation, but he did not reveal the fact all at once to his young disciples. In his room, after night prayers on Sundays, the little group would meet for a spiritual conference. Carefully, Don Bosco planted the seed, saw it germinate and grow slowly, tended the young plant. His first request to them was for their help. Meanwhile, he endeavored to provide them with a formation which should help them to carry out the work that they had undertaken under his leadership with the maximum benefit to their souls and to those of their charges. By 1854, he could feel that he was at the head of a small band of devoted followers. The youths of yesterday were growing up, physically and spiritually. On the evening of the feast of St. Francis de Sales, 1854, the patron of the oratory, a meeting took place in Don Bosco's room. Don Rua has left a short account of what there took place. On the 16th of January, 1854, we met in Don Bosco's room. In addition to Don Bosco, there were present Caliero, Roccietta, Artiglia, and Rua. It was proposed that, with the Lord's help, we should begin a period of exercising practical charity towards our neighbour. At the end of this period, we might bind ourselves with a promise, and later on this promise might be transformed into a vow. From that evening, the name of the Salesians was given to all who adopted this kind of apostolate. The time of testing had come, and the 4 clerics entered what was in fact a private novitiate, though in view of the prevailing attitude to the religious life, Don Bosco took care to avoid the word. 1 year later, on the Feast of the Annunciation, in the same room where the 4 had first taken the name of Salesians, Michael Rua, kneeling before Don Bosco, made his first yearly vows. The occasion was a solemn one for master and disciple alike, but the solemnity was not reflected in the outward circumstances of the occasion, for its simplicity was in keeping with the beginning of Don Bosco's work, and indeed of all that he did. After Michael Rua, others followed in his footsteps, and it might have been thought that possibly Don Bosco's principal difficulties were over. He had subjects who were willing to bind themselves for a year at least, and gave every indication that once it was possible for them to do so, they would take vows for life. The first steps had not been easy, but looking back over the whole story, as we can see it now, it is clear that other difficulties were just beginning. Don Bosco was called upon to exercise patience and restraint for many years to come. You can pick out promising young men, you can train them sufficiently, they may take temporary vows and be devoted to their master. They do not become exemplary religious overnight. We know the material with which Don Bosco had to deal, its qualities and limitations, for he has described it to us, and between the lines it is possible to read some of the anxiety, the heart-searching that must have been during those early years. Some 25 years later, when he was at the head of a flourishing congregation, he recalled those first beginnings. Are there any of you who still remember their first days at the oratory? How many things have gradually grown better? Then Don Bosco was alone, or nearly so. He had to do everything, to teach by day, to teach by night, to write books, to preach, to supervise study time, and to go begging for food. And all in the house was by no means ideal. There were squabbles among the clerics, unable to agree how good was to be done. Theological or literary disputes sometimes carried to extreme lengths, and ragging in the study place when the boys were away. Many could not manage to get up in the morning because they were too fond of their beds. Others did not go down to take their classes without even telling the superior. They prayed when they were with the boys, but never did any spiritual reading or meditation as required by the masters of spiritual life. All these irregularities were observed by me. Sometimes I would utter a warning, but generally I left things as they were, for there was no sin in them. And if I tried to root out all these habits at one stroke, I should have been obliged to send away all my boys and shut up the house, because these young clerics would never have adapted themselves to so strict a life. And then all government was made difficult by the independent spirit that was abroad, not to mention the attraction exerted by the secular clergy, to which I might have lost more than one of my young men, not to mention the pressure brought to bear by their families, who would have preferred to see them settled in their own diocese. I was obliged to act with great prudence, and I did my best not to be wanting in it. For those young clerics were full of good qualities. Though they were undisciplined, they were good workers, good-hearted, and morally sound. I used to think that when the first fires of youth were quenched, they would prove invaluable helpers. Nor was I mistaken. The best of today's Salesians have come from those first groups. But if at that time I had endeavored to restrain their exuberance, they would have left me to my own devices. If I had insisted on perfection, I should have achieved nothing, or very little. The oratory might have comprised 50 or so hundred people, not more. In thus describing his first Salesians, Don Bosco has given us a glimpse of himself and his methods. His government was firm but flexible, uncompromising where essentials were concerned, content to wait, to encourage rather than to chide, in order to form a community of young men whose lives should reflect the spirit that he desired in his house, and whose example should influence the boys in their charge. When we consider the material with which he had to work, and the obstacles, humanly speaking, apparently insuperable, which he had to overcome, the result that he achieved appears in its true light as the marvel that it was. He improvised, it has been remarked, from day to day, but he was quite certain about the end in view. He knew exactly what was needed, and if sometimes he seemed to change his mind, it was only on the question of means, never of the end. His account of those first days with his young clerics shows clearly his desire that life in his congregation was to be a family life. Don Bosco was a father to his future Salesians, just as he was to the boys, the apprentices, and others to whom he devoted his life. Not all his clerics were as fervent as he would have wished them to be. Not all were as recollected and demure as the picture of young religious that is sometimes held up as the ideal. But there was solid worth in these youths, and Don Bosco was content to wait for it to mature. I used to think that they would prove invaluable helpers. He was proved right in the event. In all that he did, there was a feeling of urgency, knowing the work that he alone was called upon to accomplish, the great need for it not only in Turin, but elsewhere in Italy, in Europe, and indeed in various parts of the world. And with his sense of mission that he had been upon him from his earliest years, it could hardly have been otherwise. Yet, in founding the Salesian congregation, just as in establishing the oratory, there is an attitude of deliberation, of calmness about him, that appears to belie the urgency which possessed him. When one group of youths failed him, he calmly began with another, repeating the process until he had some who were willing to learn and would stay with him. The secret of it all was his confidence that he was doing what God intended him to do, and that if he was indeed to achieve the end, the means would be found. In the same way, directly he has some suitable subjects who give promise of perseverance, he does not sit down and provide them with a rule. His method is far different. The rule develops with the congregation. He takes counsel, he studies the rules and constitutions of other orders and congregations which seem to him adapted to the times and to the work which he had in view. He draws on his already wide experience. If his sense of urgency is the mainspring of his multiple activity, it is kept in careful control and directed by his trust in God and confidence in the outcome of his endeavors when they are carried out to the best of his ability in accordance with the manifest will of God. The rule of his congregation was first sketched out in 1855. He consulted such constitutions as those of the Jesuits, the Redemptorists, the Rosminians, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He took advice from all whom he considered able to help him. But when the time came for putting pen to paper, though the influence of all these elements can be traced, what is remarkable is the mature wisdom of the man of experience, whose writings betray the author. This Don Bosco was later to acknowledge to Pius IX when he confessed that the rule of his congregation was only the setting down on paper of the fruit of 20 years' experience. He was but putting into words the spirit with which he tried to animate his young disciples. In 1857, his rule was given final form. What was, so it seemed, save for a few young clerics with private, temporary vows, a paper scheme, had now become a reality. Don Bosco can hardly have hesitated, yet it appears that he required encouragement. He received it from all quarters, firstly from that which perhaps he valued most, from Don Cafasso, who had followed all his work from the very beginning. "You must found a congregation, Don Bosco," he told him categorically, "if you wish to establish your work on a firm basis." Identical advice came from Monsignor Franzoni, in exile in France, from Don Borel, and others whose opinion he valued, and it came too from an unexpected quarter. Urban Ratazzi could hardly be called a friend of religious orders. In 1855, as Minister of Justice, he was directly connected with the first laws against religious, and 10 years later, as Minister of the Interior and President of the Council of the Sardinian States, he was instrumental in abolishing the religious life throughout the territory under his jurisdiction. Yet it was the advice of this man that seemed to have tipped the scale and convinced Don Bosco of the practicability of openly putting into immediate practice the ideas he had so long obsessed him. Ratazzi, radical as he was, held a high opinion of Don Bosco. The two men had met before, certainly in 1855, and possibly previous to that. At Easter of that year, Don Bosco preached a retreat to the youth in the Generala, the principal reformatory of Turin, and, well pleased with the results of his preaching, desired to reward the inmates with a day's excursion to Supigny, where, in the Royal Park, they could be given the opportunity of recreation and freedom, and so enliven somewhat their drab existence in captivity. Don Bosco found it impossible to obtain the necessary permission. As might be supposed, all the officials regarded the plan as just another of Don Bosco's mad schemes. He would certainly lead all the boys of the reformatory out, but how many would he lead back at the end of the day, they inquired. In the end, Don Bosco appealed to Ratazzi, who, having heard him out, gave the required permission. The day's outing took place and was a great success, and that evening Don Bosco returned to the reformatory the full complement of its inmates. Ratazzi knew and admired the work done by Don Bosco in the Valdocco quarter. Anxious to see it survive, he suggested steps should be taken to enable it to do so. "You are not immortal, you know, Don Bosco," he remarked one day. "What will become of your oratory when you are gone?" And he went on to suggest an association of helpers in close dependence on Don Bosco. "That means a religious congregation," rejoined Don Bosco. "Yet you, of all people, must know that the law—" Ratazzi cut him short. He needed no instruction on the scope of the law, which, he explained, was directed against orders possessing property in mortmain and those of older foundation exempt from the common law. What he envisaged was a society in which the members retained their civil rights, paid their taxes personally, an association of free citizens living together for a beneficent purpose. Such an institution, he asserted, would not be an infringement of the law. On the contrary, it would enjoy its protection like any other association, whether charitable, industrial, or commercial. This conversation took place in 1857. Towards the beginning of the next year, Don Bosco had come to a decision. Armed with a letter of introduction from his Archbishop and accompanied by Michael Rua, he set out for Rome. In the course of 2 audiences with Pius IX, he was able to speak of his plans and to receive the Pope's encouragement. At the 2nd audience, he delivered the text of the rule, incorporating certain modifications suggested by the Pope at the previous audience. Towards the end of March, Don Bosco returned home glad at heart. He had taken the decisive step, and all now seemed in a fair way to being settled. He had hardly foreseen that it would require another 16 years of wearying negotiations before he had obtained the final approval that he imagined could be given without difficulty, particularly in view of the Pope's encouragement. At the end of the year, he was speaking openly to his young clerics of his plans for the Salesian congregation. On Sunday, the 9th of December, having recapitulated for them the fact of the Pope's approval and the purpose of their society, after pointing out that they possessed a written rule which all were practicing freely, he went on to say that the time had come for them to emerge into the open, to assume an official name, and to acknowledge themselves members of a society to which all belonged in spirit, and some by private vows. "I give you a week to think it over," he concluded. "Whoever is not present at next Sunday's meeting will thereby signify that he does not desire to give his name to the society." At the next meeting, only 2 of the young men failed to appear. 18 of them, including a priest, Don Alassonati, a deacon, a subdeacon, Michael Rua, 13 clerics and a layman, agreed to give their names to the society, and elections were held to constitute the governing chapter. Don Bosco was elected Superior General, Don Alassonati Prefect, Don Rua Spiritual Director, Don Angelo Savio Procurator, and as councillors Caliero, Bonetti and Lazzaro. The last 4 were clerics. It would be wearisome to retail the whole course of the negotiations that took place, the difficulties that had to be overcome before definitive approval was obtained for the Salesians and their rule by Don Bosco. It was granted finally for the Salesian congregation on the 1st of March 1869, and was followed by the definitive approbation of the rule on the 3rd of April 1874, 10 years after the laudatory decree of the 23rd of July 1864. The first public vows were taken by Don Bosco's disciples on the 14th of May 1862. 22 of them met in Don Bosco's room and made their profession for 3 years into the hands of the founder. One of them, Bonetti, has left a description of the scene and tells us how they crowded into the little room. There were not enough chairs to go round. There were 22 of us, not counting Don Bosco, who was kneeling by the table. Don Rua read the form of profession, which we repeated sentence by sentence. When the profession had taken place, Don Bosco spoke to his first Salesians. "We live," he said, "in troublesome times, and it seems madness to found a new religious congregation at the very moment that the world and hell together are doing all in their power to wipe out those that already exist. But be not afraid. It is not probabilities but certainties that I am telling you. God is blessing our endeavors and desires them to continue. What efforts have not been made already to upset our plans, and what results have they had? None whatever. That forms one good reason for our confidence in the future. But my confidence is based on more solid foundations than that, and principally that we seek only the glory of God and the salvation of souls. Who can tell if heaven does not desire to make use of this humble congregation to accomplish great things in the Church of God. Who knows whether in 25 or 30 years from now on, our little group, with God's blessing, will not spread throughout the world and become an army of at least 1,000 religious. Don Bosco's prophecy was largely fulfilled. In January 1863, there were 39 Salesians. A year later, there were 61. In 1865, 80. In 1866, 90. And in 1874, at the time of the definitive approbation, 320. When Don Bosco died in 1888, his Salesians numbered 768. At the death of his first successor, Don Rua, in 1910, they had increased to 3,996. At the death of his second successor, Don Albera, to 7,600. At the present time, they number upwards of 18,000. Between that meeting in his room in December 1858 and the issue of the decree in 1874, Don Bosco's hands were full, for in addition to his usual occupations, to which he was continually adding, he was obliged to conduct the delicate negotiations at the Roman court and to convince his own archbishop of the usefulness of the new society and the advisability of gaining approval. The chief difficulty with the archbishop concerned the ordination of the Salesians. Monsignor Fransoni, always a faithful friend to Don Bosco, was dead, and in his place ruled Monsignor Riccardo di Netro, who, though formerly friendly, now opposed the new congregation on the ground that he could not tolerate in his diocese clergy who were not subject to him and trained in his seminary. Don Bosco's activity would have been much curtailed if his Salesians were to be confined to the diocese of Turin, and he was not enamored of its seminary, which for some years past had enjoyed a troubled history. At the time with which we are concerned, it was occupied by the military, and the professors were obliged to teach their few pupils in the attics to the accompaniment of various noises and general upheaval that the soldiers were wont to cause. He knew from bitter experience that those who went to the seminary were prey to all kinds of temptations to leave the Salesians and join the clergy of the diocese. Nevertheless, for some years he was obliged to send his clerics there for their philosophy and theology. A more attractive picture than the minutiae of ecclesiastical politics is the life of these first Salesians. Their days were full. In addition to teaching the boys at the oratory, supervising the apprentices, helping with the festive oratory, not only at Valdocco, but at two others in the town, they had to do their own studies and carry out various obligations as religious. It seems impossible that they should have found time for it all. Don Bosco's own busy life was a perpetual example for them. They could see him in the chapel, at meals, in his room, always occupied, never flurried, and whatever he was doing, whether praying, writing, or teaching, giving it his whole attention with complete absorption and concentration. In the very early years of the society, some of the more fervent clerics, Rua, Francesca, Caliero, for example, would get up at 3:30 a.m. In the middle of winter, they were often obliged to take snow from the gutter outside their attic windows in order to wash. The water in their jugs was frozen solid, and thus, refreshed, went to their books. It was a Spartan existence, but a homely one. Don Bosco saw to it that the house was run as a family and not an institution. The hardness of those early days seemed not to have affected the health of any of them. Don Rua died at the age of 73, Superior General of the congregation and Don Bosco's first successor. Francesca, who became one of the leading classical scholars of Italy, died at 92, and Caliero at 88, a cardinal. It is difficult to provide a connected account of these crowded years of Don Bosco's life. The multitude of his activities in running the oratory, preaching, writing, teaching has already appeared sufficiently early for it to be appreciated that his hands were full, and his days and nights not long enough for all that he had to do. And he had to contend with difficulties and trials of all kinds, which ate up his precious time, some of what, from one cause or another, he was called on to endure at this period of his life will appear in the following chapter. But a sorrow, a break with the past, and his early struggles, the loss of a good friend and counsellor that he had to bear at this time, requires mention at this point. Don Joseph Cafasso, who had encouraged Don Bosco to join the diocesan clergy and smoothed out the material difficulties on the way, had arranged for him to spend those 3 years of great importance in his career at the convito, who had watched over the beginning of his apostolate among the young, had urged him to it, and then, later, advised the founding of the congregation, did not live to see his friend and pupil's final achievement, for he died on Saturday, the 23rd of June, 1860, as the morning Angelus was being rung. The funeral took place at the Church of the Holy Martyrs, and the panegyric was preached by Don Bosco. He spoke of him lovingly and with veneration as one of whom, he said, after full inquiry, he had never heard tell that he had been guilty of any action, gesture, look, word, or jest unworthy of a virtuous boy, an exemplary cleric, a holy priest. He spoke of him as another Aloysius in the innocence and purity of his behavior, another Vincent de Paul in his charity and care for the unfortunate, another Charles Borromeo in his uprightness and austerity, another Alphonsus in his gentleness and kindness. The panegyric is a literary genre that does not always allow the preacher to show his sincerity or that he is speaking from personal knowledge. When Don Bosco spoke of Don Cafasso, there could be no doubt of either. His own acquaintance with his subject was ample enough to provide a full-length book, and his memories went back many years. He could have told his crowded audience of his first meeting with Cafasso, then a seminarian, when Don Bosco was 12, and of how he had run home to his mother, exclaiming, "I've seen him! I've talked to him!" "Seen who?" inquired his mother. "Joseph Cafasso, and I can tell you he is a saint." Joseph Cafasso came from Castelnuovo, and his whole life was spent in the Turin district, most of it at the convito, first as assistant to Don Guala, and after the latter's death as superior of the establishment. He was small, undersized almost, and deformed by a defect of the spine, yet these physical disadvantages were unnoticeable, for at first sight of him it was his face which caught the attention. His features were clear, cut and regular, lighted by eyes that were dark and clear, and surmounted by a crop of thick black hair. The general effect was one of dignity. Something has been said of the influence of the convito in combating the prevalent Jansenism among the clergy. In this, Cafasso's share was by no means insignificant, for in teaching moral theology he enjoyed an admirable opportunity of forming the younger clergy. When we hear confessions, he wrote, "Our Lord desires us to be loving, pitiful, and fatherly towards all who come to us, without reference to who they are or what they have done. If we repel anybody, if a soul is lost through our fault, we shall be held to account. His blood will not be required on our hands." It was he who introduced Don Bosco to the prisons of Turin. Cafasso accompanied over 60 criminals to the scaffold. Executions were public in those days, all of whom died penitent. My hanged saints, he used to call them, and ask their prayers. As a preacher, he was not eloquent, but he spoke to the people in their own language, and because they understood him, his sermons were effective. Jesus Christ, who is infinite wisdom, he told Don Bosco, used the words and idioms that were in use among those whom he addressed. You should do likewise. In 1860 then, Turin laid to rest another saint. Joseph Cafasso was canonized in 1947 by Pius XII. His shrine is at the Consolata, Our Lady's principal sanctuary in that town, and one that he always loved and venerated. There you may see his statue, flanked by two of his most angelic-looking marble angels that ever came from a sculptor's chisel. Don Bosco had lost a friend at a moment of particular difficulty, a man to whom he owed much. We love and reverence our dear founder and father, Don Bosco, wrote the Salesian, Cardinal Cagliero, but we love Joseph Cafasso no less, for he was Don Bosco's master, adviser, and guide in spiritual things, and in his undertakings for upwards of 20 years, I venture to say that the goodness, the achievements, and the wisdom of Don Bosco are Don Cafasso's glory. It was through him that Don Bosco settled in Turin, through him that boys were brought together in the first Salesian oratory. The obedience, love, and wisdom that he taught hath borne fruit in those thousands of young people in Europe and Asia and Africa and America who today are being well educated for life in God's church and in human society.